Today I am filming my 51st review and I really could not resist the temptation of reviewing a game called 51st State. It just made so much sense. 51st State is a game, a card game for 2 to 4 players. It is set in an hypothetical world of the future where the United States have been devastated by a series of catastrophes and disasters. It looks like a wasteland like the one that you see in the movies of the Mad Max series. The players take the role of one of 4 factions that are trying to expand their power to the point of becoming the predominant faction, to create the 51st state. So the theme and the premise are interesting, but let's see how the game plays. The rulebook is only 12 pages long, but I did not find it very easy to use. It has a certain abstract quality. After reading it, I was very confused about many things. Maybe there are things that are implied, there are concepts introduced earlier, but you need to know things that I'll explain later in order to fully appreciate. And then I taught the game to some friends, hoping, well, when I'm teaching it, I'm gonna get a better sense myself. And no, they were confused. I was even more confused after teaching the game. We really needed to set the game up and try. And the first game was far from exciting because we were referring to the book all the time and discussing and debating how does this work, how does that work. But after a while, things started going much better. I think it's a game that you really need to set up and you start playing, and then after a while you start getting the flow, and when that happens the game is fun. So do not be discouraged at the beginning. Practice makes perfection, and that applies to this game too. Each player will take the role of one of the 4 available factions, which are Mutants Union, Merchants Guild, New York, and Appalachian Federation. Each faction comes with a base card which tells you the resources that that faction receives each turn, and each faction also has 3 contact cards. The contact cards are always the same. You will always use these 3 cards with New York, always these 3 with Appalachian, so I'm not really sure why they didn't print all the information on a larger card, but whatever. The important thing is that each of this contact card will allow the faction to accomplish a specific action. You have the blue action, which is establishing a negotiation, the red action, which is conquering a location, and the tan action, which is incorporating a location. What's important is that the cards will force the players to play differently, because the factions will have to spend different resources to accomplish their things, and in order to do so, the players have to use different strategies. So when you're playing different factions, you do play differently, and that's a good thing. At the beginning of the game, each player receives a faction and the corresponding initial resources. Then you shuffle the deck, you deal 4 initial cards to each player, and you're ready to start. Each turn starts with the lookout phase, which is when players receive new cards. In each lookout phase, you will flip 5 cards face up from the deck, and the players will alternate selecting cards from those available. There are different rules according to which the way in which you select cards changes depending on the number of players, but independently from that, at the end of the lookout phase, each player will have 3 new cards. 2 that will have been selected from those available face up, and 1 randomly drawn from the deck. After the lookout phase, you had the production phase, in which players will receive resources, which are represented by these tokens, based on quite a large variety of factors. And because of that, I found that explaining the details of the production phase before explaining the rest of the game can be very confusing. Not many things would make sense, so I'm just gonna skip that for now. Just trust me. Production phase is when you get this stuff. Next, you have the action phase, which is when players play cards and execute all sorts of other actions. The range of options, things that you can do during the action phase, is remarkable. It's pretty vast, and because of this, the game is not that easy to teach, because new players don't really realize how many things they can do. But of course, this also makes the game more rewarding once you actually master all the options that are available. One of the things that give this game its specific flavor is the fact that you can play each card in any one of 3 ways. You can play a card for its red area, or you can use the white, grayish area, or the blue area. You can only use one of the 3, so there are going to be choices to be made not only when you're choosing which card you're going to use, but also in which way you're going to use a card. In order to play cards, the players need to use their contact cards and the associated resources. Suppose, for example, the Merchants Guild wants to execute the red action, which is conquering a certain location. Then the Merchants Guild need to use the resource that is required, which is a gun, and you place the gun there. And now, because of this, the Merchant's Guild would be able to conquer a card which is up to 2 places, spots, range. It's not clear. This is distance, but I don't really know the unit of measure. Anyways, you can conquer a card up to 2. So in this case, the player would be able to conquer this card or this card. Suppose the player decides to conquer this one. We are using the red part of the card only, so we're placing the card there under the base card so that only the red part is showing. And this is the area that has been conquered. It will give a one-time large advantage. Basically, you're just looting the place. A lot of good stuff, but only once. Later in the game, in fact, the player will be able to basically burn this card and receive all the resources that are listed there. In alternative, the player could have used that same card or another card to establish a negotiation, which is the blue action. To establish a negotiation, you use another type of resource, which is fuel. Suppose that the Merchant's Guild had done that, wanted to establish a negotiation, then because of that card, the Merchant's Guild would be able to establish a negotiation with any of these cards because 3 is the highest range that can be covered. Suppose it's the same card, but now we are going to look at the blue section of the card only. So negotiation is established, the card is placed there with the blue part showing, and this indicates a resource that is going to be received by the guild every turn. So it is less resources than if you're looting the area, but it gives you a much steadier source of income. A third option is to use a card to incorporate that location in the player's growing state. In that case, the player pays the resources that are necessary. Suppose the Merchant's Guild does that. Now could incorporate any of these 2 cards. Now this one too far. Suppose the player decides to incorporate the Guns Trader, and the card is placed on the table face up, and now only the central part is going to be used. Cards that have been incorporated remain on the table in front of the player and can be used every turn. These cards that have been incorporated have 3 relevant pieces of information. One is the effect of the card, which is listed here. In this case, this card allows you to destroy a gun to gain a victory point. Then here you have when and how the owning player can use that location. In this case, the owning player needs to spend a worker token on this card, and then he can execute this action. And here on top, you have information telling you whether or not this card can be used by other players, which I'll explain in a second. There are cards like the one that I showed you before that can be activated by the owning player by spending a worker token there, and those cards cannot be used by other players. There are cards that have a factory symbol there, and that means that that card will produce the listed resource during the production phase. So yes, this is one of the ways you get stuff during the production phase, and that cannot be used by other players. But there are also cards that have the ability of producing resources for the owning player during the production phase. This one, for example, will produce a brick, but you can see the worker symbol there, different from those ones. Those cards with this symbol can also be used by other players. That means that during the turn, a non-owning player can spend a worker, basically giving the worker to the owning player, and in return, that card will give the listed resource to the non-owning player. In this case, the non-owning player will gain a brick and the owning player has received a worker. This creates interesting challenges because you need to be able to produce your own resources, possibly without helping the other players too much, because it is good that you get the extra worker, but if they're getting used resources that they really need, that in the long run can hurt you a lot. Also, it creates a strange thing about the theme, because these factions in this Mad Max world, actually they seem very cooperative and very nice to each other. Oh, please come and use my quarry, and so you can make some bricks. Oh, that's nice of you, but then please let me lend you some of my workers. I'm just trying to show you some gratitude. So I don't know that fits the theme too well, but it works well in terms of mechanics, so I don't worry too much about that. Another possible action is to play a leader card. Leaders have a distance of 0, so they can be played for free. And once you play them, the leaders will give you a one-time advantage, which usually is a number of resources that you get at that point. And once in play, they create a condition that, when met, will give victory points to the owning player. For example, if this leader is in play, for each gun location that the player is owning, then the player gains a victory point. Here is the same with locations that have the scrap symbol. However, the tricky thing is that you can only have one leader in play at a time. If you want to replace the leader, you have to spend a gun token, then you eliminate the leader and you can play another one. Of course, the meaning of the gun token is that you give them a gun and you tell them go and sell it and start a new career, and the guy, oh, okay, I'll do that. Or at least that's the way I like to think of it. And when you thought that that was all, well, it is not. There are more actions available to you. You can send out your workers to look for resources, meaning that you discard 2 workers to receive a resource from the bank, or you can discard 2 cards to draw a card from the deck. Not ideal, but if you don't like the cards in your hand, sometimes it may be the only way. Or a very important action, you can redevelop cards that you already played face up and they're already been incorporated in your net. To do that, you spend a brick and then you can eliminate that card and replace it with another card, disregarding the distance. So that could be very good if you're trying to play cards that are outside of your range, outside of the range given to you by the contact card, or maybe you just use your contact card and you really want to bring another card on the table. The only requirement is that the card that is being redeveloped must have a symbol in common with the new card. In this case, the old trader could be redeveloped as this other card because they have that symbol in common, or that same card could be redeveloped as an office block because they have that other symbol in common. The players can execute any of the actions that I described before in any order and as many times as they want and the resources allowed them to. After all players pass, the action phase is over and you count the victory points. And at that point, you see if you have a winner for that turn. Executing certain actions will earn you victory points. For example, replacing a leader gives you 1 victory point. All the locations that you have in play will give you 1 victory point each. The leader count for 1 victory point, and then certain cards will give you victory points. Some cards will give you a victory point or 2 victory points when you execute a certain action, like here, spend a worker, destroy a scrap and get 1 victory point. Other cards will give you a victory point or 2 victory points when they enter the game. The first player to have 30 victory points on the table in front of him or herself is the winner. This game has been compared to Race for the Galaxy, and I think there are definitely good reasons for doing so. First, I think that both games are not complicated games, but they do have a steep learning curve. I really don't think I'll ever teach this game to anybody anymore. I'm done with that. I'll just play with people that already have learned the game from other sources. Also, both games require you to create an empire in a non-deck building fashion, and both games have the feel that players are playing their own solitaire, just trying to get to achieve the victory condition before the other people do. The interaction is really minimal. However, there are similarities with Race for the Galaxy, but this game really feels very original. It is very much its own thing. The fact that you can play cards in 3 different ways is so refreshing, so interesting. It opens so many possibilities and options. On top of that, you can also execute so many other actions, send your workers to work in different factories or send them out to look for resources. So many things you can do. You add to that the fact that if you're playing as New York is completely different than if you're playing as the Merchants Guild, then really it is a game that it is swarming, it is vibrating with possibilities and options. So many actually at the beginning may be a little daunting. It might take you a while to realize what really the optimal combos are, what the optimal strategies are, especially if you're trying a new faction. But once you get the flow of the game, it's not just once you learn the rules, but when you really start getting a grasp of the general mechanics and how you develop a strategy, then it can be an extremely engaging and fun game. I personally had a very good time playing it. I think that with expansion will be even better, even more exciting, but as of now, this is already a very good game.